Thanks to the choir, to Michelle, and to Elizabeth for that beautiful anthem. The story of Jesus' baptism is a time when the wholeness of God is on ready display. When God, the Creator, when Christ, the Redeemer, and when the Spirit, the Sustainer, are all in the picture together. For in the story of Jesus' baptism, again, we hear that as Jesus came up from the water, the heavens were opened to him, and he saw the Spirit of God descending like a dove, alighting upon him, and a voice from heaven saying, "This is my Son, the beloved, with whom I am well pleased." It's a time when we can perhaps catch just a glimpse of God, the three-in-one, the Trinity, which is a mystery, and yet here it is on full display. God in all of God's glory, but in all these manifestations of God, Father, Son, and Spirit, Creator, Redeemer, and Sustainer. The theme of Jesus as the beloved Son of God also appears in St. Paul's writings, and St. Paul speaks of Jesus as the first among many beloved children of God. And in the book of Galatians, Paul writes extensively that when we are baptized into Jesus, that we too are like adopted children, and that God's Spirit cries out in each of us, "Abba, beloved," and we experience our own belovedness. It also reminds us as well that according to Paul, that when we are baptized into Christ, there is no longer male or female, no longer Gentile or Jew, no longer stranger and brethren, no longer free or slave, but all are one in Christ Jesus. And Jesus makes that point also in his final instructions in the Gospel of Matthew to his disciples, when Jesus says, "Go to all nations, go to all people," not just selectively to certain people or certain nations, but go to all nations to proclaim the good news, to make them disciples, and to baptize them. In other words, baptism is a sign not only of our individual, unique belovedness, but also very much of our universal humanity, and that we all share in common this ability, this capacity, this character of being God's beloved. It reminds me a little bit of the children's song that we used to love to sing in Vacation Bible School. All God's creatures got a place in the choir. We've got a lot of creatures up here with places in our choir. Do you all remember that song? All God's creatures got a place in the choir. Some sing low, some sing higher. Some sing loud like a telephone wire. Others just clap their hands or paws or anything they got now. Y'all remember that? The point that all God's creatures have a place in the choir. But we know from experience that sometimes the place for some of the creatures we would prefer that they would be far away from us, not so much in our own backyard. Have any of you had any experience with the Himalayan blackberries? They're part of God's creation, right? But we'd prefer that they're not in our own backyard. Right? Any of you have had the experience of trying to get rid of Himalayan blackberries? Anyone out there? I imagine, yes, some of us. And this is not original to me, but to one of our leaders in our regional land and housing coalition, Lavita Gilmore Jones, who happens to be an African American woman and has lived through a lot of the experiences of systemic racism and oppression throughout her life. And recently, in our meeting earlier this month of January, she spoke of the experience of she and her brother deciding to move in together and to create a household and to purchase a piece of property out towards Hillsborough, which happens to be in the Tualatin River watershed, not quite in the floodplain, but certainly part of the watershed, and that at this particular house, the front of the house, the sides are landscaped in beautiful ways, and about the back third of the property is taken over by Himalayan blackberries. So what she talked about is some of the challenges of getting rid of Himalayan blackberries, and those of you who are familiar with this, if you just kind of try to chop them off at the ground level, what happens? They are prolific, right? If you chop them off at ground level, they just get that much stronger and bigger and come back more and more vigorously, right? And that is because they have these very strong rhizome root systems that go off in every which way. And what is the one way that you can actually try to get rid of Himalayan blackberries? You can use chemicals, yes, that is one way, but if you're not inclined to use toxic chemicals, then the only way is to try to pull them up by the roots, right? It's not a particularly enjoyable or pleasant experience. But what if, say, here, just a few paces out the door where we have that tremendous stand of Himalayan blackberries, kind of on the edge of our property, what if we were to go out there and try to remove those blackberries? So at certain times of year, they're very vigorous. They even provide some shelter to other animals, perhaps some young mammals or perhaps birds. But there is a time of year in the late fall and winter when they tend to die back a bit. And then if we could kind of cut them off at ground level, then we could begin to experience and explore the roots. And if we could actually open up the earth a bit, we could see all the ways that the roots are all intertwined and have really taken over all the topsoil there, right? And we know that Himalayan blackberries are so vigorous because they're very adept at crowding out other plants, right? They can take all of the nutrients out of the soil and make it very, very difficult for other plants to grow. And we do know, in fact, that Himalayan blackberries are not native to the Pacific Northwest, that somebody at some point thought it was a good idea to bring some blackberries our way, and now they are prolific in so many areas, right? The only way, as we said, to really get rid of them is if we can kind of expose and pull them out by their roots. So the point that Levita Gilmore Jones was making to us is that in some ways, these invasive plants that can take over the territory, that can pull all the nutrients out of the soil and can crowd out the native plants, in some ways that's a metaphor of things like historical and systemic racism and oppression. And we know from experience that attitudes and policies like slavery in the United States or apartheid in South Africa, and the list could go on, are based in a fundamental denial of the essential humanity of others. The sense that in order to, the root of that kind of prejudice and oppression, it's legitimized, it's validated, right, by an attitude that the other, whoever the other may be, that the other is really not fully human. And if we're really honest about our own history, we know that that plays a part in our own history here in Oregon as well, because when the Oregon Territory was organized and when the U.S. legislature passed those donation land claim acts for homesteaders, the language of the legislation specifically excluded people of color. Others, white Anglo-Europeans, could receive 320 acres per person, but people of color were not allowed. Even worse than that, when the Oregon Territory was organized and began developing its own rules and regulations, African Americans were specifically excluded and prohibited from residing in the Oregon Territory on pain of whipping. On pain of whipping, they were not allowed. And we know that on through the years that people of color were prohibited from owning property in Oregon, and that still some of us probably today have in our property deeds a clause that excludes people of color from owning property in some of the places where we live. We know even in our church that our church, the Methodist Church, was divided in the mid-1800s over issues of slavery. Some of you may know that there was a Methodist Episcopal North and a Methodist Episcopal Church South, because the Methodist Episcopal Church South agreed upon, validated the pattern of slavery, which again essentially denied the humanity of black people. We know even our famous Methodist missionary who came to Oregon in the 1830s to bring Christian faith to Oregon, like so many of his peers, did not really consider Native Americans to have a soul. Such was the denial of their essential, fundamental humanity. And we know that that didn't stop there in the 1850s, because even later in that, after over 95, maybe even 97% of the Native Americans who populated this area before Europeans came, before contact, 95 to 97% of them over a generation or so had died from illnesses that they were unfamiliar with, that they had no immunity to. And those who were left were not considered to be fully human, because again, when this Land Donation Claim Act was developed, it was considered that the Willamette Valley was uninhabited territory, that there were essentially no people living here, and apparently there were some, maybe close to 100 Native American residents that were still here in the mid-1800s. And so finally there was a treaty that was never approved by the Congress, and so it never went into effect. But nevertheless, they were removed to the Grand Ronde Reservation because they were considered to be, again, people who weren't really human, who didn't really have any human rights. And if that wasn't bad enough in the 1850s, then in the 1950s, because still Native rights were getting in the way of progress, their identity as Native tribes was removed. They were simply considered to be no longer persons. In the 1950s, and in my lifetime, and in many of our lifetimes, this kind of divisiveness of denial of others' humanity continues in our church today, and we know that for 50 years, the Methodist Church has been divided over the denial of humanity of persons with a variety of different sexual orientations, of lesbian, gay, bisexual, transgender, and others. And so we know that these divisions have played a role over and over again. And like the Himalayan blackberries, these systemic denial of others' basic humanity can take over, can suck the life out of the soil, can crowd out the natural relationships that could flourish if somehow these systems, these historic systems, could be pulled out by the roots. Many of us probably remember the era of apartheid in South Africa. And in some ways, it had very similar roots to slavery in the United States and other parts of the world, certainly similarities with colonialism around the world. And some of you may recall an individual, Nelson Mandela, who was a leading figure in the protest movement against apartheid until he was arrested and tried for sabotage in the early 1960s, along with several others who were in leadership with him of the African National Congress. And he assumed at that point that he, with his legal background, he assumed that he would get the expected sentence, which was to be hanged. But rather than creating martyrs of them, the South African government at the time chose to imprison them in isolation on Robben Island and require them to do forced labor, breaking up rocks and repairing roads. And it was assumed that this kind of harsh treatment would eventually break the spirit of Nelson Mandela and the other political prisoners who were imprisoned there with him in extremely harsh isolation. All of their communications between the prisoners and the mainland, their family, their friends, were highly censored. They were allowed one letter every 6 months and one family visit for 30 minutes every year. And that went on for 27 years. First on that isolated Robben Island prison, much like our Alcatraz and San Francisco Bay, a place that there was no opportunities for escape. Later on, Nelson Mandela was transferred once and another time. And interestingly enough, throughout his imprisonment, there were 3 particular prison guards known as warders in the South African prison system. So 3 different South African who were white nationalist Afrikaners, all of them who grew up in a certain amount of poverty and deprivation themselves and joined the National Prison Service as a way to at least have the income security and social status of a civil servant. And they were all instructed that they were not to have anything really to do with the prisoners except what was absolutely minimally necessary. But somehow, over those 27 years, with all the various warders or prison guards that dealt with these who were thought to be enemies of the state that threatened the status quo of apartheid. Among them, there were 3 who eventually came to know Nelson Mandela, and he knowing them on human terms. And in fact, he writes in his memoir, A Long Road to Freedom, that the basic learning for him from those relationships is that we can begin to see, even in our worst enemies, their essential humanity. So while he had suffered with miserable, disrespectful treatment for 27 years at the hands of the prison system, he found in these 3 particular warders or guards, he found their essential humanity, and that gave him hope. It gave him hope because he imagined that if these sworn enemies could discover the essential common humanity in one another, that perhaps there was hope for a post-apartheid Democratic Republic of South Africa. Those relationships fanned his hope, and when he was finally released through negotiations, secret negotiations with the government, eventually he and South African President de Klerk together shared the Nobel Peace Prize in the early 1990s, and he was elected president of the newly post-racial first multiracial election in South Africa's history. And so we give thanks for that story of discovering one another's common humanity. And it reminds us as well of the words of Martin Luther King Jr., whose birthday we celebrate tomorrow. And that part of his "I Have a Dream" speech on the Washington Mall, when he says, "I have a dream that my children will be judged not by the color of their skin, but by the content of their character." I believe recognizing and celebrating and calling forth our essential humanity is part of what it means to be a true child of God, because we know that we are all created in God's image. So as we celebrate this week the memory and the legacy of Martin Luther King Jr., let us also recall that we too are baptized into Christ, and we are called to incarnate the belief that all of God's creatures are God's beloved. Amen.